this second session of Women in Biblical Literature. And as we saw last week, the Bible is in fact an androcentric text. It was written by men to promote their interests. Many of the Old Testament laws and customs were designed to control women in this patriarchal social system that was dominated by men. But when we studied primeval history and the creation stories, especially the story of Adam and Eve, we learned that these conditions were not the Creator's intent. They came about as a consequence of sin, the sin that Adam and Eve both committed in disobedience to God. That's what the Bible says. So as a consequence of sin, man came to dominate woman and other men, which led to murder, rape, slavery, war, so many of the ills that continue to infect our society today. Another consequence of sin was a distorted view of femininity that emerged. Eve, the first woman, was seen as foolish or as a temptress. Women brought sin into the world. They are inferior by design. They're destined to be dominated by men, so on and so on. This twisted view has been accepted for centuries, even up to the modern era, where we saw last week. In modern culture, in John Steinbeck's East of Eden, these stereotypes persist. But in the biblical stories of women, we're going to see sparks of God's design intent shining through this patriarchal oppression. We're going to especially see that this week when we start to talk about some of the matriarchs of the patriarchal period. These women had strong personalities that subverted these patriarchal expectations and norms in order to help fulfill God's plans. So as we said in ancient Israel, most women were valued primarily as wives and mothers who produced sons to carry on the husband's name. And today we're going to meet some of these wives and mothers. The matriarchs of the patriarchal period being from about 2000 to 1700 BCE in biblical history. And the stories are told in the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50. Now, in these chapters, we're going to notice that the writers of scriptures were actually pretty creative. They were pretty savvy. They used a variety of literary devices, including type stories. So we're going to see barren wife stories, annunciation stories, and woman at the well stories. As we study the matriarchs chronologically, then we're also going to group them by these So to backtrack a little bit, last week we saw how sin and corruption spread rapidly from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel, Lamech, and then Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, so on and so forth. Humanity became very corrupt, but there were a few righteous men and women who worshiped God, and among them were Noah and his family, who survived the great flood that God had sent to wipe out human corruption. And then 10 generations after Noah, Abraham was born. He was the first of the patriarchs being Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, for every patriarch, there's at least one matriarch. The patriarchs and the matriarchs were quote, chosen by God to form this holy nation, this holy people, the Israelites, also known as the Hebrews. Much later in their history, they were known as Jews. So through this first nation, God was going to bring about salvation. Now, ironically, 3 of the first 4 matriarchs, the mothers of the Hebrew nation, were barren. They were infertile. They were unable to have children. So this is one favorite biblical type story, the barren wife story, okay? As we said, women were valued primarily for their ability to produce sons, and barrenness was a disgrace. It was believed to reflect God's disfavor. The first barren wife we're going to encounter in scripture is Sarah, the barren wife of Abraham. So she's Abraham's wife. She was also the mistress of her maidservant, her Egyptian maidservant Hagar, and she'll eventually become the mother of Isaac. So we'll look at her in all 3 of these roles tonight. Now, towards the end of Genesis 11, there's this long genealogy listing all of Abraham's ancestors. And then when it comes down to Abraham, the writer tells us that Sarah's wife is barren, almost as an aside. Abraham's wife, Sarah, is barren. It's almost as an aside. Now, Sarah was barren. She had no children, Genesis 11:30. This one short verse sets up the central conflict, the whole drama of the narrative that spans several chapters in Genesis. And we'll see how that happens. Abraham, as I said, was a righteous man. He was a wealthy, sort of semi-nomadic herdsman. He owned slaves, he owned herds, he owned servants. Sarah and Abraham dwelt in present-day present-day Iraq, which is then Mesopotamia. And then God tells Abraham to leave his homeland and go into the land of Canaan in present-day Israel. So Abraham obeys and he travels to Canaan. In Genesis 12, God promises Abraham he will be the father of a great nation. He will have many, many children. But we already know that his wife Sarah is barren, right? So this is the tension, the conflict in the story, and the story is going to be about how God is going to fulfill this promise. Now let's note that God spoke to Abraham, not to Sarah. Initially, God does not tell Abraham that he's going to sire a great nation through Sarah, nor does the text indicate whether Abraham even tells Sarah what God has said. So as far as we know, Sarah's in the dark. 4 chapters later in Genesis 16, she's still childless, and she takes matters into her own hands. To remove her disgrace and to provide a husband, an heir for her husband, she, quote, took her maidservant Hagar and gave her to Abraham to be his wife. Genesis 16:3. Now, you remember from last week that ancient Near Eastern law says a wife may purchase a slave as a concubine for her husband, but the text specifically says that she gave him to Abraham as his Isha, which means woman or wife. She's not a concubine, she's a wife. This becomes important later, but Sarah's plan backfires. Hagar conceives a child, and then she becomes insolent. She gets cocky towards Sarah, so Sarah mistreats her, and Hagar runs away. Now here, the focus of the story shifts onto Hagar. She'll be called a maidservant, she'll be called a wife, she'll be called a slave woman at various points in the story. Hagar runs away and goes to the spring in the desert, and who finds her? God finds her there. Now the text says an angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar, but then later it shifts to the Lord himself appeared to and spoke to Hagar. So basically it's God who finds Hagar and starts speaking to her. And the term is theophany. A theophany is a manifestation or appearance of God. So Hagar has just become the first person in scripture to be visited by God or an angel of God. This lowly slave woman, this lowly maidservant, God or the angel, whatever, tells her to return to her mistress Sarah and submit to her. The angel also tells her something that only God could know. He said, "You are now with child and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." Genesis 16:11. Ishmael, the word Ishmael means God hears. That's the Hebrew definition of the word. So Hagar is now the first person in scripture to receive an annunciation. That is the appearance of the Lord or an angel of the Lord who makes an announcement to her. Mind you, Abraham heard from God about his future, his, being the father of a great nation, but Hagar actually saw God. So this introduces another type story, an annunciation story. All annunciation stories in scripture contain certain elements: the appearance of the Lord or an angel of the Lord, a message of birth, the child's name is given, the child's future is predicted. And the angel, when he spoke to Hagar, he also predicted Ishmael's future. Hagar, in turn, gives God a name. Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." Genesis 16:13. The Hebrew is Be'ir Laha Roy. In other words, God, I see you, and now you see me. Hagar returns to Sarah and Abraham, and she bears a son. Abraham names the child Ishmael, as the angel had said. So, is Ishmael going to be the heir that God promised? The answer comes in the form of another annunciation, this time to Abraham. In Genesis 17, God speaks to Abraham again and says, Sarah will have a son who you will name Isaac. Sarah will have a son named Isaac, and Isaac shall be your heir. So Abraham sort of laughs in disbelief. He and Sarah are too old to have children, and Sarah's barren. Again, the text does not tell us whether Abraham shares this news with Sarah. In Genesis 18, the promise is repeated a third time when three heavenly visitors, that is angels, or it's another theophany, okay, stop to visit Abraham. And here they are speaking only to Abraham. However, this time, Sarah overhears. Now, Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind Abraham. Sarah laughed. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Genesis 18:11-14. So finally, in Genesis 21, the promise is fulfilled. Now the Lord did for Sarah what was promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. Now that Sarah has a son, Abraham and Sarah have a son, what's to become of Hagar and Ishmael? Well, when Sarah's son Isaac is about 3 years old, Sarah sees Hagar's son Ishmael mocking her son Isaac, and she gets upset. So she tells Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21:10. Abraham didn't want to, but he agreed. He sends Hagar and Ishmael off into the desert with a little food and a skin of water. We have to stop here and make a comment, because what Abraham and Sarah are doing is wrong. They're violating both ancient law and custom. In fact, Deuteronomy 21:15-17 says, if a man with two wives must give a double share of his inheritance to the firstborn son, and that would be Ishmael. Remember, Sarah gave Abraham Hagar as a wife. Okay, so she's a wife and Ishmael is his son. The text makes no comment about this, but the reader, if the readers are paying attention, they're going to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture. Thereafter, after Isaac is born, Sarah pretty much disappears from the text. Her name is mentioned only a few more times in Genesis, and her death is recorded in Genesis 23. But the prophet Isaiah remembers her as the matriarch of the Israelites. In Isaiah 51:2, Isaiah says, "Look to Abraham your father and Sarah who gave you birth." So Sarah and Abraham are both remembered, and revered by the Jews as well as Christians. What became of Hagar and Ishmael? Let's go back to Genesis 21. Hagar goes off into the desert with Ishmael, and when her water runs out, she worries, she starts to cry. Again, God speaks to her. He opens her eyes and shows her a spring where she can draw some water. And he makes her promise that Ishmael will become a great nation too. God ensures Ishmael's future. Ishmael does become a great nation. The descendants of Ishmael are the Arabs or the Muslims. In fact, Muslims claim descent from Abraham and Hagar. And they also claim that, Ishmael was the promised heir, not Isaac, but that's another story. So as we come to the close of the story of Hagar and Sarah, what can we learn from this? Abraham is touted as a model of faith. God promised him a son. His wife was barren. He waited and waited. He was too old, but he's held up as a model of faith. Well, Sarah is a model of faith too. Once she finally learned that God intended for her to have a son, wow, within a year, she had a son. So she was important. She was really part of God's plan. God promised her a son. God fulfilled his promise. She became the mother of the nation of Israel. Hagar, on the other hand, was used by Sarah and Abraham. Her status shifted depending on Sarah's feelings towards her. First, she's a maidservant, then she's a wife, then she's a slave woman. But I think this story shows that Hagar was very important too. God looked out for her, and in ways she was honored more than Sarah. Sarah and Abraham never called her by her name in any of the texts. It's always that woman, that slave woman, or whatever, that maidservant. God spoke to her by name. God saw her. He saw her as a person. He heard her. He sent her a messenger, and he made her the mother of a great nation too. Hagar spoke to God personally, and she's the only person in scripture who ever gave God a name. So she's important too. I think you can take a lot away from these texts. It just depends on which commentary you're reading or where your mind is at. But I think these stories are meant to show that, number one, God keeps his promises. That's, this is all faith, right? God has compassion for the oppressed, especially Hagar and Ishmael. And that God calls women as well as men to help build these great nations. On the downside, it also shows to me the impact of social pressure on women in ancient Israel who were valued only if they could produce sons, and the conflicts that resulted. And then note the social hierarchy. Abraham, the man, the wife, the maidservant, and down, none of which reflected God's creative plan, creative intent for human equality and mutuality, which we saw in Genesis 1 and 2. There's a lot here. I mean, you could go on. You could spend years just studying these stories, but we have to move. So the story of Sarah and Abraham will now become the story of their son Isaac, which begins with another type story, a woman at the well story. Woman at the well stories. These are narratives that appear at an important point in the life of the heroine. She meets a man at a well. Her life is transformed as a result. Now, in the ancient Near East, it was a woman's job to draw water, usually from a community well, and bring it back to her household. So the first woman at the well that we're going to meet is Rebekah, who will become the wife of Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac, and then the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now, a little backstory here. Abraham, when he was old, sent his servant back to his homeland in Mesopotamia to find a bride for his son Isaac from among his own people. The servant arrives at a well. And the servant prays to God and says that if he meets a young woman from Abraham's family who gives him water and also offers his camels water, this will be a sign from God that she's a chosen bride for Isaac. So he sets up all these conditions and then says, okay, God, you go ahead and meet these conditions for me. So along comes Rebekah to draw water. She happens to be related to Abraham. I think she's his great niece. She gives the servant some water, and then she runs and waters his camels too. So the servant knows he's found a bride for Isaac. And their betrothal is arranged right at the well. The servant brings out some gifts, some jewelry, offers it to Rebekah, and she agrees. And the deal is, they make a deal. Then the servant is invited back to Rebekah's home, and the engagement is confirmed there by her family. The text says the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Genesis 24:28. It's pretty significant that Rebekah ran and told her mother's household about these things, not her father's household. We don't know where her father was. The text does not mention him, even though, according to ancient Hebrew law, the woman moved out of her father's house and moved in with her father-in-law, and this became so important. Not in this case. Rebekah is kind of running the show here. So Rebekah and the servant leave and head their way back to meet Isaac, and Isaac meets them along the way. And the text tells us that Isaac brought Rebekah into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah, and he loved her. Again, it's significant that they went into Sarah's tent, not the home of Rebekah's father-in-law. So you have all these rules and laws that were established that people in the text proceed to ignore. And the text says that Isaac loved her. She's the first woman in scripture for whom marital love is actually expressed. But they did not live happily ever after because Rebekah was barren. She had no children for 20 years. Isaac prayed to God, and finally she conceived twins. But she's having a problem pregnancy. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Genesis 25:22-23. So she's just received an oracle from God, which foretells of the enmity between her sons and their descendants. And sure enough, she gives birth. Esau comes out first. He's so named because he's red and he's hairy. Jacob comes out second, grasping his brother Esau's heel. Now, according to, again, we have to Talk about ancient Near Eastern custom and law. The firstborn is supposed to inherit a double portion of the father's wealth and be considered the rightful heir. But God just told Rebekah that the older son, Esau, is going to serve the younger, Jacob. And this is exactly what happens in the story. And we see that Rebekah makes sure that it happens when her husband Isaac is on his deathbed in Genesis 27. In Genesis 27, Isaac's on his deathbed, and Rebekah is going to manipulate to ensure that the son that she favors Isaac. I mean, she favors Jacob, not Esau. She's going to make sure that Jacob gets the inheritance. The story goes that Isaac is old, his eyes are very dim, he doesn't see very well. So he calls his son Esau, the oldest son, and says, son, I want to give you my final blessing, but before I do, go out and hunt and catch some wild game and make a delicious dish and bring it back to me. It's one reason why he liked Esau better. Esau was the hunter, you know. So Esau goes out to hunt some wild game, and then Rebekah goes into action. She goes out and kills an animal, you know, a domestic animal, makes a delicious meal, and I think it was a goat. So she skinned the animal, they skinned the animal, and then she put the goat hair on Jacob's arms. And she sends Jacob into his father, gives him the meal, and Isaac says, oh, is that really Esau? And Jacob says, yes, it's Esau, Dad. See, I got the hairy arms. So Isaac eats the meal, and then he blesses Jacob, and he promises his inheritance. And in those days, this was like a done deal. It was like a legal contract. Jacob has officially received the inheritance, and Esau was cheated out of it. When Esau comes back, he's very angry. He threatens to kill his brother. So Rebekah sends him back home to Mesopotamia, to her uncle's home in Mesopotamia, her brother's home, to save Jacob's life. So the story of Rebekah. She is actually the one who controls the family's destiny. She's the second woman in scripture to receive a divine oracle directly from God. By ensuring that Jacob inherit Isaac's blessing, she's actually cooperating with God's prophecy. And she really does have a critical impact on salvation history, because her son Jacob will have 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation from whom the Messiah will be born. If you're Christian, that's significant. If you're Jewish, that's just significant that he was the father of the 12 tribes. People question the ethics, Rebekah's ethics, you know, and the argument could go either way. It's interesting to read about the commentaries on these things. Now, as the story of Rebekah ends, Jacob, who flees to Mesopotamia and arrives at a well in Rebekah's homeland. Now, the story of the next two matriarchs begins with another woman at the well story. This one has an odd twist. Jacob meets Rachel, the daughter of his uncle, at the well. Rachel's very beautiful. Rachel's father agrees to let him marry Rachel, but he's tricked into marrying her older sister Leah first. You got to figure, how did that happen? Well, back in those days, the bride was veiled until after the marriage was consummated. So Jacob didn't know what was happening until it was too late. In the end, he ended up marrying both of them, Leah and Rachel. So this story is a story of two matriarchs. Leah, the older sister of Rachel, she was an unloved wife of Jacob. Jacob didn't love her, and she became the mother of 6 tribes of Israel. Then there's Rachel, who's the younger sister of Leah, the loved wife of Jacob, and the mother of 2 tribes. And guess what? The story of Rachel is a barren wife story. You gotta love how the writers put these stories together. They're just really cute. We said that a woman was valued only if she produced sons for her husband. But in Leah's case, this was not enough. She was unloved because her sister Rachel was more beautiful. So, and this is not an unusual theme. A woman's beauty, not her character, not her faith, not her courage, not her ability to produce sons, was so prized by men that even a fertile wife, Leah, was rejected as inferior. Now here we see the 2 sisters, you know, in a friendly sibling embrace. But this picture better shows the family tensions that surrounded them. It shows Jacob negotiating with the father to marry Rachel. Rachel's up front here primping, and Leah is sort of sitting in the background, kind of forlorn. So like Jacob and Esau, Rachel and Leah become rivals. Leah gives birth to 4 sons. And each time she gives birth, she names her son according to her hope that her husband would love her. One name meant like, this time my husband will pay attention to me, but he never does. Then after 4 sons, she stopped having children. In Genesis 30, we learned that in their ongoing competition for Jacob's attention, both Leah and Rachel use their maids as surrogate mothers. First, Rachel, she has no son, she's desperate, so she gives her husband her maidservant, and 2 more sons are born. Then Leah, not to be outdone, gives Jacob her maidservant, and another 2 sons are born. So in this picture at the right, we see Jacob and a couple of women. There's a woman there, a woman there. I'm not sure which one is Rachel or which one is Leah, which one are the maids, but between them, you can see that they produced a lot of children, a lot of sons for Jacob. Then Leah's first son, Reuben, brought home some mandrakes one day. Mandrakes are kind of a root plant that are believed to induce pregnancy, and they're also an aphrodisiac. So he brings them home, and Rachel wants them. She wants to have her own son. So she makes a deal with Leah. She says, Leah, you can sleep with Jacob tonight if I can have some of those mandrakes. So Leah agrees, and after sleeping with Jacob several times, perhaps with the help of the mandrakes, she produces 2 more sons for a total of 6. Finally, Rachel, the barren wife, has a son, also possibly with the help of the mandrakes. And she says, God has taken away my disgrace. She named her son Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. Well, in Genesis 35, Rachel had another son, Benjamin, but she died in childbirth. Oddly, in the end, Jacob asked to be buried not with Rachel, the wife he loved, but with Leah, the wife he did not love. So like the story of Sarah and Hagar, this story illustrates the problems that arise, I think, when women are forced to compete with one another for a man's favor. This is contrary to Genesis 2:24. Remember, the man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 will be one flesh. Just like Sarah and Hagar, the women were at odds with each other, but they were sisters. They couldn't send one another away. Moreover, marrying 2 sisters was against Mosaic law, but Jacob couldn't really be held responsible because he was tricked into it. And finally, although Leah was unloved, it was Jesus the Messiah came from the tribe of Judah, which was one of Leah's sons. So it all worked out for Leah, who kind of suffered from neglect during her entire married life. Now we move on to the Exodus, and this is a period in biblical history that dates from about 1700 to about 1280 BCE. Here's a little bit of background. At one point in his life, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. Israel means he who wrestles with God. You may know the story about Jacob wrestling all night with God or an angel of God. His 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. That is the nation of Israel, the Hebrews, or not until later did they become the Jews. I don't mean to insult your biblical intelligence here. I just want to fill in for people who may not be familiar with it. So Jacob's or Israel's sons lived in Canaan, but a famine in the land sent them down into Egypt. And in Egypt, they grew into a great nation. They became so numerous that Pharaoh felt threatened by them, so he enslaved them. And then to further oppress them and control their numbers, Pharaoh told them to throw their newborn baby boys into the Nile. So this sets the stage for the story of Moses and his mother and sister in Exodus chapter 2. Does anybody know the name of Moses' mother? She does have a name. It was Jochebed. The name means the God is glory. Yah meaning Yah or Yahweh, the name of God. So she's the first person in Scripture to have a name that incorporates the divine name of God. She's a woman. And then there's Moses' sister, Miriam. In Exodus 2, Jochebed gives birth to Moses, but she refuses to throw him into the Nile. She defies Pharaoh's order and hides him for a while. And then when she can't hide him anymore, she makes this little basket, and she makes a little ark out of a basket and puts him in the Nile, sends him down the river. And then Miriam follows along watching. At one point, Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the Nile to take a bath, and she finds little Moses. And the text says the baby was crying and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. So you can see Miriam hiding there in the reeds. She steps up and offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. So Moses's mother becomes the wet nurse, and she was paid by Pharaoh's daughter to nurse her own child. Look at the irony here. While she's nursing him, she gets to keep him. Then she returns him to Pharaoh's daughter after he's weaned, and Pharaoh's daughter adopts him and raises him in her household. The king of Egypt had ordered all the sons of the Hebrews to be killed. Now, one of them becomes the son of his own daughter. I think that's great. These stories, what can we learn from this? Oh my gosh. They're stories of oppression, they're stories of hardship, but they're also the stories of these three courageous women, Jochebed, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter. And all three are instrumental in bringing bringing the people of the children of Israel out of slavery and into the promised land. Moses' mother, his sister Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter herself brought this about. Miriam, furthermore, her story continues into the Exodus. We know her as a sister of Moses, but we also know her as a leader of the Exodus. And again, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but Moses was chosen by God to lead the children of Israel. Pharaoh did not want to let them go. So with God's help, Moses inflicted all these plagues on Pharaoh. Finally, Pharaoh says, okay, let them go. So they march out of Egypt and they're free until they get to the Red Sea. And then they can't go any further. So Moses puts his staff into the seas part, the children of Israel march across on dry land. When they get to the other side, the seas come together again and Pharaoh's army is destroyed. And Miriam leads the women in a victory song after crossing the Nile. That was her role. It's one of the roles of prophets. And we're going to talk about prophets more next week, I think. But for now, take my word for it. Miriam, the prophet, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea." Miriam is the first woman to be called a prophet in the Old Testament, and she correctly attributes the Hebrews' escape. She is remembered as a prophet by another prophet, the prophet Micah, who said, "I brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to you to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam." When Micah says this, I did this, what he means is, thus says the Lord, I brought you out of Egypt, etc. And Miriam was one of your leaders. Now, after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, the children of Israel arrive in the promised land. And the next phase of their history tells about the conquest of the promised land, which was led by the Israelite general Joshua. The period in biblical history is roughly 1240 BCE to around 1050 BCE, which is when the monarchy is established. So in Joshua chapter 2, we meet another interesting woman in the history of Judaism and Christianity, Rahab. She's a Canaanite. She's a resident of the city of Jericho, a Canaanite city. She's a Gentile, okay? She's a prostitute. So this woman, mind you, is triply marginalized in the eyes of Orthodox Judaism and Christianity. She's a woman, she's a Gentile, and she's a prostitute. She's a very unlikely heroine, and yet she becomes one. And this is how it happens. Joshua, who's the leader of the army, sends 2 men in to spy out the land before the army invades. Joshua's spies go to the home of Rahab in Jericho. Text doesn't tell us why. Use your imagination. The king hears that they're there, the king of the Canaanites, the city, and he tells his soldiers, go tell Rahab to give those men up. But like Moses' mother, Rahab refuses to cooperate. She lies. She says, oh yeah, the spies were here, but they left. So she protects the spies by hiding them under a pile of flax on her roof. She sends the king's men on a wild goose chase, right? And then she speaks to the spies and this virtual oracle of Israel's pending success. She says to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land. and all of us who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. This is a virtual divine message that heralds Israel into the new land, spoken by a woman. So after the king's men have left, she helps them escape. And she asks them to perform a special act of kindness. She has been kind to them. She asks for kindness in return. She asks that when the army comes back to destroy the city, that her and her family will be spared. So the spies give her a scarlet cord and tell her to display it outside her window. And when the army returns, if they see the scarlet cord, they will say, okay, we will spare the family in that home. She does as she's told. And when the city is attacked, Rahab and her family are spared. So Rahab saves her entire family. They join the children of Israel, the chosen people. And Rahab is actually remembered in the New Testament in the letter to the Hebrews, where it says, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Hebrews 11:31. So here we have yet another courageous woman. She risks defying royal orders to help others and to help her family. And, you know, whether you're a believer or not, this shows that people who read the Bible, it shows them that God reaches out to the marginalized, that even people like Rahab, who you would never expect to rise to the occasion, play a vital role in salvation history. Under the leadership of Joshua, the children of Israel conquer the promised land. And what follows is a period of judges, okay? They divide the land into 12 allotments, one for each tribe, and they have formed a sort of confederacy of the 12 tribes, but they had failed to drive out all the inhabitants of the land. So what follows are 12 40-year periods where you have peace. They live in the land in peace. Excuse me. And then the people get lax. They turn away from the Lord. They start sinning. The Lord delivers them into the hands of their enemies. Then they realize, oh, we were wrong. So they cry out to the Lord. The Lord raises up a judge to deliver the people. And then you have another cycle of peace, okay? There were 12 of these 40-year cycles in the book of Judges. Now, these judges are really not judges who judge court cases. Most of them aren't. They're more like charismatic leaders who rise up to the occasion to lead the armies against their enemies. But as the cycles continue in the book of Judges, people tend to fall deeper and deeper into unfaithfulness and sin. And what they really need is a king. At least that's the argument in the book. It was written to defend Israel's claim, its call for a king, which is kind of contrary to God's plan that they should be that it should be a theocracy, that God should be their king. Now, they wanted a king like all the other nations, right? And throughout the book of Judges, this refrain runs through. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own sight. So in the end, this whole book is used to justify the need for a king. But getting back to the judges themselves, 12 of them were men. One of them was a woman, Deborah. And her story is told in Judges chapters 4 and 5. The first few verses of chapter 4 introduce her, and they give us a lot of information about her. At that time, the prophet Deborah, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. So we know right off the bat she's a prophet. It says that she's the wife of Lapidoth. But scholars have studied and determined that there was no such name for a Hebrew man at that time. There was no such thing as a Lapidoth. So why are they saying she's his wife? Well, she's called Isha Lapidoth, okay? Isha can mean wife or it could mean woman. Remember that from last week, right? And Lapidoth, the word Lapidoth in Hebrew means torch. So really a better translation is she's a woman of the torch, or a fiery woman. Translators want to call her the wife of Lapidoth because they want to think, oh, she's, she borrowed her husband's reputation, and that's how she got to where she was. But there's nothing like that in the text. She's a fiery woman. Let's call her that. So she's a prophet, and she's also a judge, and she's the only judge who was actually judging Israel before she was called to lead them into war. She was settling disputes. It says that she used to sit under her palm tree and people would come to her with their disputes and she would settle them. She's the only female judge. And she's the only judge in the book of Judges who was also a prophet. So she really has quite a pedigree. She has quite a resume there. The Samuel, towards the end of Judges, or in the book of Samuel, we learn that Samuel was a prophet and he had been a judge. But I mean, Deborah is the only judge and prophet in the book of Judges. And we'll talk more about her prophecy later, but let's go on to the story in Judges. So the people are being oppressed by the Canaanites, right? They had fallen into sin and God let the Canaanites rise up and oppress them. And the Canaanites are led by this general Sisera. So as a judge, Deborah has to deliver the Israelites from the Canaanites. She summons her general, Barak, and gives him orders to amass his troops and head up to Mount Tabor to fight. What does Barak say? If you come with me, I will go, but if you do not come with me, I will not go. Judges 4:8. I'm sorry for laughing, but I just think that's funny. So Deborah agrees to go. She says she'll go, but she makes a prediction. Okay, I'll go with you, Barak, but it is into a woman's power that the Lord is going to sell Sisera. So the Lord will hand the Canaanites over to the Canaanite general Sisera over to a woman. Who is the woman that she's referring to? We don't know yet. Yeah, we'll find out. So the troops assemble in formation and Deborah delivers an oracle to Barak. Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. So it's already happened. Go. You're going to win. As Deborah predicts, the Canaanite army is defeated. General Sisera flees on foot and he arrives at the tent of a woman named Yael. She's the wife of Heber the Kenite. And the Kenites were another group that lived in the land, and they happened to be at peace with the Canaanites, so they're kind of like allies. Yael's husband is away at the time, so she invites Sisera into her tent, and he asks for refuge. She gives him refuge. She gives him a blanket. She gives him warm milk. He asks her to keep guard and to lie about his presence if anyone comes looking for him, and then he falls asleep exhausted. And the text says, Yael picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to Sisera while he lay asleep. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground and he died. It doesn't say why, but we can sort of assume that because the Kenites and the Canaanites were allies, the Israelites who are now the victors, well, you know how war goes, to the victor go the spoils. So maybe she, being a woman, was afraid of becoming victimized herself, so she wanted to kill Sisera before the invading army victimized her. At any rate, her actions were in line with God's will. God wanted this general killed, and as Deborah predicted, she did it. Then Barak arrives looking for Sisera, and Jael meets him and says, "Come, I will show you the man you're looking for." So obviously her deed sort of put Sisera and Barak to shame. But Deborah's prophecy came true. The Lord handed Sisera over to a woman. And here we have two more strong, courageous leaders and warriors during what was a very unstable time in Israel's history. We're going to see how unstable that was with the story of the Levite's concubine. And I'm warning you, this is probably one of the most disturbing stories in the book of Judges, if not in the entire Bible. Okay? Now a Levite who lived in a remote area of the hill of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Okay, a Levite is kind of like a professional priest. The concubine has no name. Throughout this whole story, they don't even name her. And then as the story goes on, let's look at two different translations because it makes a huge difference. The King James version says, "She played the whore against him and went away from him unto her father's house to Bethlehem in Judah." Well, "play the whore" is a poor translation because no woman is likely to become a prostitute and then conduct her her business from her father's home. It just didn't happen. I'm not sure what the Hebrew phrase is, but I know that there's more than one way to translate it. And the Revised Standard version says she became angry with him and she went away from her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah. Much better translation. She spurned him, she took off, went back to her dad. The text doesn't say why. Did he mistreat her? We don't know. But we know that she was there for 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. On their way home, they stop in this town and they can't find a place to stay, but this nice old man comes up to them and invites them to stay at their house. So they go to his house. And then this is where things go south. Then some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." Homosexual rape, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. The owner of the house said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. This man is my guest. Look, here's my virgin daughter and his concubine. I'll bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to the men, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. Obviously, you don't need Carol Myers, who wrote one of the books that we're using in this class, to tell you that sexual violation of women was considered less shameful than that of men, at least in the eyes of other men. So the Levite picks up his concubine in the morning, shows no emotion, tells her to get up. She doesn't respond. He picks her up, puts her on his donkey, and leaves. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them to all the areas of Israel, each of the 12 tribes. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt." Just imagine. The story doesn't even tell us exactly when or how she dies. And then the rest of the story, as it goes on, it says that the other tribes took revenge on these men who raped the Levite's concubine. But really, the bloodshed and the rape just continue. So yeah, the story is intended to show us that social religious chaos preceded the institution of the Israelite monarchy. The book ends with a refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own sight. So it's a polemic in favor of a king. But the fate of the concubine, as Phyllis Tribble says, it was particularly gruesome. This is what she calls a text of terror. To me, it shows the precarious position of women in the ancient Near East. They could be judges, they could be prophets, or they could simply be victims of abuse. Now we'll move on to one more story. It's a happier story, the story of Ruth. This also takes place sometime during the era of Judges, but it's a separate book, the book of Ruth. Who is Ruth? She's the daughter-in-law of an Israelite woman named Naomi. She becomes the wife of Boaz. She's the mother of Obed and the great-grandmother of King David. So a little background on Ruth's story. There was a famine in Israel. A certain Israelite man, Elimelech, and his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons go down to Moab, as you can see, south of the region across the Dead Sea, to survive. And after a while, Elimelech dies, so Naomi's widowed. And then her 2 sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Ruth is a Moabite. She's a Gentile, okay? The Jews consider her not good. And they were at odds with the Moabites. There's a law in Deuteronomy 23:3, which says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation." The law forbade Israelite men from marrying Moabite women because it was a mother who determined if a child was a Jew, was an Israelite. If a Jewish man married a non-Jewish woman, the children were then not Jewish. If a Jewish woman married a non-Jewish or Gentile man, the children were considered Jewish. So all throughout the Old Testament, Jewish men were discouraged from marrying foreign women. They blamed foreign women on everything. Anyway, back to the story of Ruth. So 10 years Later, Naomi's sons die. Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah are now widowed, and they're all destitute. What were the options for widows back then? Very few. They couldn't just go out and get a job. They either had to remarry, or they had to beg, or they had to become prostitutes. Those were their only choices. But the famine in Bethlehem has ended, so Naomi and her daughter-in-laws plan to return to Bethlehem, hoping to be able to survive there. On their way, Naomi thanks them for their kindness and their loyalty, which is a key theme of the book. And she says to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. She tells them to return to their home so they can remarry. Their chances for remarrying are better if they stay put rather than going back to Israel, where Moabites are disliked. Orpah returns, but Ruth insists on staying with Naomi. Don't urge me to leave you, she says. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. This is a very famous line. Ruth has just made an oath of loyalty and love to her mother-in-law. And the story now becomes a struggle of these two widows to survive in a patriarchal environment. Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem during the harvest. Ruth goes out to glean in this field that's owned by Boaz. He happens to be a powerful relative in Elimelech's clan, so he's distantly related to Naomi. Now, Jewish law required landowners to allow the poor to pick up scraps that were left during the harvest. So Boaz sees Ruth out there gleaning, and he asks around and finds out that she's actually taking care of her mother-in-law, Naomi. So he's really impressed with her loyalty. He's kind to her, he gives her some extra. And Ruth goes home and tells Naomi that she's met Boaz, and Naomi's mind starts to get into gear. She devises a plan. And by the way, she really is the dominant person in this book. She's the active one. Ruth kind of just goes along. But she tells Ruth, look, take a bath, get dressed up, put on your perfume, and then go to Boaz as he sleeps on the threshing floor, a place where men have been working and drinking, and uncover a place at his feet. So, the guys are working, and then they just crash right there where they've been working, right, on the threshing floor. And they're drunk, and, it's good opportunity for prostitutes to make a little money. But Ruth, she just does what Naomi says. She obeys. She goes down and finds Boaz and lays down at his feet, and he wakes up and sees her, and he says, who are you? He doesn't recognize her, and she says, I am your servant, Ruth. Aha, now he gets it. And she says, spread the wing of your cloak over your servant. What she's saying is, would you marry me? It's so cute. And Boaz is flattered. I mean, he's older than Ruth. He thinks she could find somebody much younger, but he agrees to marry her. The story says that Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until morning, but rose before anyone could recognize her, for Boaz had said, let it not be known that this woman came to the threshing floor. Doesn't look good. So Boaz made sure that nobody saw her, and he sends her home with provisions for her and Naomi. And then he goes to the gate at the town square and performs a sort of public gesture indicating that he intends to marry Ruth. So the witnesses to this gesture bless them in the name of the matriarchs. They say, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. In other words, we hope you have 12 kids. Boaz marries Ruth, and she bears him a son named Obed. Naomi is happy. She has a grandson. She has a son-in-law. She's set for life. She has someone to replace her sons. And she, like Ruth, has been blessed by God. So this is a nice story. Ruth becomes the ancestress of David and then Jesus, because Jesus was descended from David through her marriage to Boaz. And enlisting Jesus' genealogy, and in Matthew chapter 1, it goes on and says, and Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So Matthew actually remembers Ruth. He includes her in a genealogy. This non-Jewish Moabite woman becomes the ancestress to King David, who is Israel's most beloved king. And if it just shows the universality of salvation, that God includes whom God chooses to fulfill these plans. It shows that Ruth was faithful, loyal to her mother-in-law. Both her and Naomi were desperate widows, but they were willing to take risks. I mean, she actually posed as a prostitute in order to accomplish God's plans. So today we've seen a lot of strong, courageous women who did not fit the mold of male dominance and female submission. But in the story of the Levite's concubine, we do have a grim reminder of the lowly status of women in the ancient world. And unfortunately, what happened to her continues to happen today because some men still regard women as objects. They believe that they're free to dominate and control and abuse. However, the story of Ruth shows what women can accomplish when they dare to step out of these traditional roles, take initiative, and trust God. Thank you all for listening so intently. Are there any questions?